Hi friends, welcome to a new brand's video. Tonight I'll bring you a new horror stories, but before we begin, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe only if you like tonight's stories. Only a few ads in the first 10 minutes and after that all completely ads free. And without further ado, dim the light, pull up your blanket and let's begin the stories.
My name isn't important, but for context, I've been a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park for almost 7 years. Most people imagine the job as peaceful. Wide forests, beautiful mountains, wildlife, quiet trails, and to be fair, most of the time, it really is like that. But there are nights out there that feel different. This happened late in September, near the end of the camping season. The weather was already getting colder, and most tourists had started leaving. The forest was quieter than usual, fewer campers, fewer cars. Long stretches of silence between radio calls. I was working the night shift that week. Night shifts in Yellowstone are strange. During the day, the park feels alive with people and animals. But at night, especially deep inside the forest, everything becomes slow and heavy. The darkness feels thick between the trees. Your flashlight only shows a narrow path ahead, and everything outside that beam just disappears into blackness. Around 9:40 p.m., I was sitting in the ranger station, filling out some routine reports, when the radio on the desk came to life. Another ranger had received a report from a couple at a small campground called Blacktail Ridge. They said a man from the next campsite had gone hiking earlier in the afternoon and never came back. That, by itself, wasn't extremely unusual. Some hikers underestimate how fast the sun goes down in the forest. But the couple said something that made the situation more serious. They said his tent was still there. His backpack was still there. Even his food and most of his gear were untouched. The only thing missing was the man. The camper's name was Daniel Harper. According to the registration log, he arrived 2 days earlier. Solo camper, mid-30s. Experienced hiker, at least according to the notes. Normally, a missing hiker search starts the next morning when there is daylight. But temperatures were expected to drop below freezing that night. If he was lost somewhere, without proper gear, waiting until morning could be dangerous. So the decision was made quickly. 2 rangers would start a night search. One of them was me. I loaded the usual equipment into the truck. A powerful flashlight, spare batteries, radio, first aid kit, thermal blanket, and a sidearm. The gun wasn't really for people. It was mostly for bears. Yellowstone has a lot of them. The drive to Blacktail Ridge took about 20 minutes. The road was empty the whole way. No other cars, no headlights in the distance. Just the forest stretching endlessly on both sides of the road. When I arrived, another ranger named Cole was already there. He leaned against his vehicle with a flashlight in his hand. "Campers are over there," he said, pointing toward a small cluster of tents. The couple who reported the missing man looked nervous. They said they last saw Daniel around 4 p.m. He told them he was taking a short hike before dinner. He never returned. We checked his campsite. His tent was neat and organized. Sleeping bag inside. Backpack next to the entrance. A small portable stove sitting unused. Everything looked like someone who expected to come back soon. That's what bothered me the most. Cole and I decided to follow the nearby trail first. It led into a dense section of forest that most campers avoided at night. Before leaving, I asked the couple one last question. "Did you hear anything unusual tonight?" They looked at each other for a moment before the woman answered. "Not unusual, just strange." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Around sunset, we heard someone walking in the trees behind our campsite. We thought it was Daniel coming back." She paused. "But the footsteps never came out of the forest." That was enough to give me a strange feeling before we even started. Cole and I switched on our flashlights and stepped onto the trail. The deeper we walked, the quieter the forest became. No wind, no animals, just the sound of our boots moving over the dirt path. About 15 minutes into the search, my radio gave a short burst of static. At the exact same moment, Cole suddenly stopped walking. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed his flashlight toward the ground. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, boot prints, and they were leading off the trail straight into the thickest part of the forest. Cole looked at me and said quietly, "Looks like Daniel left the trail." I nodded and followed the direction of the tracks. At first, everything made sense. A lost camper might wander off the path trying to find a shortcut. But after a few minutes of following the footprints, something about them started to feel wrong. The steps were uneven, not like someone calmly walking. They looked like someone moving quickly, almost running. And then, about 30 yards deeper into the forest, the footprints suddenly stopped. Just stopped. No turn, no change of direction, no sign of struggle. The ground ahead of us was untouched. Cole slowly swept his flashlight across the trees, and that's when we saw something hanging from one of the branches. Something that definitely did not belong in the middle of the forest. And when I realized what it was, a very cold feeling spread through my chest, because it was Daniel Harper's jacket. But the way it was hanging made absolutely no sense. The jacket was hanging about 7 feet above the ground on a thick tree branch. It was clearly Daniel's. The couple at the campsite had described it earlier. Dark green, heavy fabric, the kind of jacket hikers wear when the temperature drops at night. But the way it was hanging made no sense. The branch was high and stretched outward from the trunk. There was no reason for a jacket to end up there. It didn't look like it had simply fallen or been placed there casually. The sleeve was twisted around the branch in a strange way, almost like someone had lifted it up there. Cole stepped closer and aimed his flashlight upward. "Maybe he climbed the tree," he said. But even as he said it, it sounded doubtful. The tree trunk was thick and smooth. There were no low branches to climb. Even someone athletic would struggle to reach that branch without help. I scanned the ground carefully. Still no new footprints. The soil around the tree was soft enough to hold clear tracks, but there were none besides the ones that had led us here. Daniel's prints had ended several feet away from the tree. Cole walked slowly around the area, checking with his flashlight. "No signs of animals," he said. "No drag marks either." That made the situation even stranger. If a bear or another animal had been involved, the ground would have shown it clearly. I looked up at the jacket again. The sleeve moved slightly in the cold night air, swaying slowly back and forth. The forest around us felt unusually quiet. Yellowstone forests are never completely silent. Even at night, there are insects, distant animal sounds, or the wind moving through the trees. But right then, it felt like everything had stopped. Cole reached up with a long stick and carefully pulled the jacket down from the branch. He inspected it under the flashlight. "No blood?" he said. The jacket was cold and slightly damp from the night air. Then he turned it over and frowned. "What?" I asked. He held the jacket out so I could see the inside lining. There were long scratches across the fabric, several of them, deep enough that the inner threads were pulled apart. They did not look like damage from normal hiking. They looked like something had grabbed the jacket and pulled hard. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did I. Finally, he folded the jacket over his arm. "Let's keep following the area around here," he said quietly. We moved slowly through the trees, searching with our flashlights. Every step felt heavier now. About 10 minutes passed. Still no sign of Daniel. Then my radio crackled again with static. I tried adjusting the channel, but the signal kept fading in and out. That sometimes happens in dense forest areas. But the timing felt strange. While I was adjusting the radio, Cole suddenly stopped again. "Do you smell that?" he asked. I took a breath. At first I thought it was just the damp forest air. But then I noticed it. A faint smell, something sour mixed with the scent of wet soil. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Cole moved his flashlight slowly across the trees and stopped on something ahead of us. "Over there," he said. About 20 feet away, there was a small clearing between the trees, and in the center of it was a camping lantern sitting on the ground. It was turned off, but I immediately recognized the model, the same brand many campers use. We approached carefully. The lantern looked recently used. The metal surface was still slightly warm when Cole touched it. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "If this belongs to Daniel, it means someone was here very recently." But the clearing showed no fresh tracks besides ours. No footprints, no signs of anyone walking around. Just the lantern sitting alone in the dirt. I turned my flashlight toward the trees surrounding the clearing. That was when I noticed something else. On the trunk of one of the trees, about 6 feet above the ground, there were marks carved into the bark. 3 long lines, deep and uneven. They didn't look like something made with a knife. The edges were rough and jagged, almost like they had been scraped into the wood. Cole stepped closer to the tree and examined the marks. "Could be a bear," he said. But his voice didn't sound convinced. Bears do scratch trees, but these marks looked different. Too narrow, too deliberate. And then we both heard something. Movement. Somewhere deeper in the forest behind us. Not loud, just the sound of something slowly moving through the trees. We turned our flashlights in that direction. The beams cut through the darkness between the trunks, but the forest was too dense to see very far. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. About 40 yards away, between 2 trees, there was a shape standing in the darkness. At first I thought it was just another tree, but then the shape shifted slightly, very slowly, and I realized we were looking at a person, or at least something that looked like one. The figure stood perfectly still, too still. It didn't respond to the light from our flashlights. It didn't move away. It just stood there, watching us from deep in the forest. Cole whispered, "Daniel?" No answer came back, and the longer we stared at the figure, the more something about it started to feel wrong. Not just strange, but deeply unsettling, because the figure looked far too tall to be the missing camper. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The figure remained between the trees, partially hidden by darkness. My flashlight beam reached it, but only faintly. The forest there was dense, and the light could not fully illuminate whatever was standing there. Cole raised his voice slightly. "Daniel, if that is you, we are park rangers. You are safe." The words disappeared into the trees. No answer. The figure did not step forward. It did not step away either. It simply stood there. At first I thought maybe the person was injured or confused. That sometimes happens with lost hikers. They can become disoriented and act strangely. But something about the posture felt unnatural. The body looked stiff, almost frozen. Cole took a few cautious steps forward. "Daniel?" he called again. Still nothing. The figure shifted slightly, not like a normal person adjusting their balance. The movement looked slow and awkward, like someone who was not used to standing upright. My stomach tightened. I had worked in Yellowstone long enough to understand how strange things could appear in the dark forest. Sometimes shadows and tree shapes can trick your eyes, but this did not feel like that. The shape was clearly human, and yet something about it felt wrong. Cole raised his flashlight higher and took a few more steps forward. I followed him, although every instinct in my body was telling me to stay where I was. As we moved closer, the figure slowly stepped backward, not turning around, not walking normally, just stepping backward deeper into the forest. That was when Cole stopped. "Hold on," he said quietly. He lowered his voice and looked at me. That is not Daniel." I asked him why. He pointed the flashlight beam more carefully. The light finally reached the figure clearly for a moment, and I immediately saw what he meant. The proportions were wrong. The body looked unusually tall and thin. The arms hung lower than they should have, almost reaching the knees. The head tilted slightly to one side in a way that did not look comfortable. But the part that made my chest tighten was the face, or at least where the face should have been. The light was too weak to show details, but I could clearly see that the skin looked pale, almost gray. And the eyes reflected the flashlight in a strange way, not like a normal human reflection. The figure stepped backward again, still facing us, still watching. Cole spoke quietly. "We should not follow that." I agreed immediately. Every part of the situation felt wrong now. We were deep in the forest, far from the campsite, with poor radio signal and limited visibility. If something strange was happening out here, chasing it deeper into the woods would be a terrible decision. But before we could turn around, something else happened. From somewhere behind the trees where the figure stood, a sound came through the forest. Not a human voice, not an animal sound either. It was low and uneven, like something breathing slowly through a blocked throat. The figure suddenly turned its head sharply toward that sound. Then it moved, but not in the direction we expected. Instead of approaching us, it quickly moved sideways through the trees and disappeared into the darkness. The movement was surprisingly fast. Too fast for someone who had looked so stiff only moments earlier. Within seconds, the forest was empty again. Cole and I stood there for several seconds, listening. The strange breathing sound continued for a moment somewhere deeper in the woods. Then it stopped. Complete silence returned. Cole exhaled slowly. "I do not like this situation," he said. Neither did I. We decided to head back toward the trail and report everything to the station. The search could continue in the morning with a larger team and daylight. As we began walking back, I kept turning my flashlight toward the trees around us. The forest suddenly felt much darker than before. After about 5 minutes of walking, Cole stopped again. "Wait," he said. I turned around. "What is wrong?" He pointed his flashlight toward the ground behind us. At first, I thought he was looking at our footprints, but then I saw the other tracks, fresh ones. They had not been there earlier. The footprints were large and deep in the soft soil, and they were following directly behind us, step by step, as if something had been walking quietly in the forest while we moved, watching us the entire time. Cole slowly turned his flashlight toward the trees behind the tracks. For a moment, we saw nothing. But then, far between the trunks, something pale moved slowly behind a tree. And this time, we realized something that made the fear much worse. There was more than one of them. When we realized there was more than one of them, the fear changed immediately. Until that moment, part of my mind had still been trying to explain everything logically. A lost camper behaving strangely. A trick of light between the trees. Maybe even another group of hikers moving through the forest at night. But the tracks behind us and the pale shapes between the trees destroyed those explanations. Cole slowly raised his flashlight and scanned the forest again. For a brief moment, the beam passed between two trees about 50 yards away, and we saw them. Two tall shapes standing several feet apart, both of them extremely thin, both of them standing completely still. Their skin looked pale in the weak light, almost the color of ash. Their arms hung long and loose at their sides. The heads were slightly tilted, almost like they were observing us carefully. They did not step forward. They did not retreat. They simply watched. My chest felt tight, and for the first time in my years working in Yellowstone National Park, I felt something close to panic. Cole spoke quietly. "We are leaving." Slowly. I nodded. Neither of us turned our backs completely toward the forest. We began stepping backward toward the direction of the trail while keeping our flashlights aimed at the trees. The shapes did not rush toward us. They did not follow quickly. But as we moved, I could see them shifting positions between the trees, not approaching directly, just staying near the same distance, always watching. The feeling was worse than if they had attacked. It felt like we were being studied. After several long minutes, we finally reached the main trail again. The ground there was harder, covered with dry soil and small rocks. It was more difficult to see footprints. Cole whispered, "Do not run." Running in the dark forest could easily lead to injury. And if those things were faster than us, running would not help anyway. We continued walking steadily toward the campsite. The distance felt much longer than before. At one point, I looked back again into the trees. For a second, the flashlight beam caught another pale figure standing behind a tree trunk. This one looked slightly smaller than the others, but it had the same strange posture and the same unnatural stillness. Eventually, the faint glow of the campsite lanterns appeared through the trees ahead. I have never felt relief like that in my life. When we stepped out of the forest and into the open campsite area, the tension in my chest finally loosened slightly. The couple who reported the missing camper were still awake inside their tent. They came out immediately when they saw our lights. "Did you find him?" the man asked. Cole and I exchanged a quick look. "We found some of his belongings," Cole said carefully. "We are calling for a larger search team in the morning." I used the radio again, and the signal was finally clear enough to contact the station. We explained that the missing camper had not been located and that the search would continue at daylight. Neither of us mentioned the figures in the forest over the radio. Some things are difficult to explain over a standard report. Later that night, after the couple returned to their tent, Cole and I searched the area near Daniel's campsite again. That was when we found the final piece of the puzzle. About 20 yards behind Daniel's tent, near the edge of the trees, there was a small clearing. We had not noticed it earlier in the darkness. In the center of the clearing, there was a patch of disturbed soil. Cole aimed his flashlight down. Half buried in the dirt was Daniel Harper's boot. Just one boot, still with his foot inside it. The ground around it looked like something had pulled him across the soil and into the forest. But the drag marks ended after only a few feet. After that point, there were only deep impressions in the dirt. Large impressions, much larger than a normal human footprint. We did not enter the forest again that night. The search team arrived the next morning with several more rangers and tracking equipment. They searched the area for 2 full days. They never found Daniel Harper. They never found the strange tracks either. By morning, the ground looked normal again. Officially, the report listed him as a missing hiker who likely suffered an accident in the wilderness. But I know what we saw that night, and Cole knows it too. We never spoke about it again after that week. But sometimes, when I work the late shift and look out at the dark forests surrounding Yellowstone, I remember those pale figures standing between the trees, watching quietly, waiting in the darkness. And the worst part is this: we never discovered how many of them were actually out there. My name is Mark, and for almost 6 years I worked as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park. Most people imagine the job as peaceful. They picture tall trees, quiet trails, and animals moving calmly through the forest. In many ways, that image is true. Most days were routine. I checked hiking trails, helped lost visitors find their way back, and sometimes spent hours alone near the lakes, just watching the water move in the wind. I actually loved the quiet. Some rangers struggled with how empty the park could feel after sunset, but I enjoyed it. When the tourists left and the roads became silent, the forest felt more honest. You could hear the wind moving through the trees and the distant sounds of animals that usually stayed hidden during the day. But there was one place in the park that always felt different to me: a lake area in the northern part of my patrol route. It wasn't famous like the big landmarks visitors usually came to see. Most tourists never went there. The road leading to it was narrow, and the trail around the lake was long and quiet. Because of that, rangers were assigned to check the area regularly, especially during the evening. That place looked beautiful during the day. The water was calm, surrounded by pine trees that stretched high into the sky. On clear afternoons, you could see the mountains reflecting perfectly on the surface of the lake. But once the sun started going down, the place changed. It became too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's paying attention to you from somewhere in the trees. I remember my first patrol there very clearly. It was my second year as a ranger, and I had already spent hundreds of nights in different parts of the park. I had dealt with bears wandering near campsites and helped hikers who underestimated how cold the mountains could get after dark. So I wasn't someone who scared easily. That night started normally. I parked the ranger truck near the trailhead and stepped out with a flashlight and radio. The air smelled like wet soil and pine trees. The sky was turning dark blue as the last light disappeared behind the mountains. The lake was about a 10-minute walk from the road. As I walked down the trail, the forest slowly became darker. My flashlight moved across the path, lighting up rocks, tree roots, and small patches of grass. I remember thinking how strange the forest sounded that evening. Usually there are small noises everywhere in Yellowstone at night. Insects, distant animal movement, wind moving through the branches. But that night felt strangely empty. The silence wasn't complete, but everything sounded far away. When I finally reached the lake, I stopped for a moment like I always did. It was part of my routine. I would stand there, look across the water, and listen. The surface of the lake was completely still. No wind, no animals moving along the shore. Just dark water, stretching out in front of me. I turned off my flashlight for a moment to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon had started rising behind the trees, and its reflection spread across the lake like pale silver. Normally, that view felt peaceful. But that night, something about it made my chest feel tight. At first, I thought it was just fatigue. Rangers often work long shifts, and sometimes your mind starts imagining things when you're alone for too long. So I walked closer to the shoreline. The ground near the lake was soft and damp. My boots pressed into the soil as I stepped forward. I looked across the water again, expecting to see nothing but the reflection of trees and sky. That was when I noticed something strange. On the far side of the lake, near the tree line, something was standing there. At first, I assumed it was an elk. Animals often came to drink from the lake at night. But the longer I looked, the more confused I became. Because whatever was standing there wasn't moving like an animal. It was standing completely still, and it looked tall, too tall. Even from that distance, I could tell its shape didn't look right for any animal I had ever seen in Yellowstone. I remember staring at it for several seconds, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then something even stranger happened. The reflection in the water moved, but the figure near the trees didn't. That was the moment I felt the first real wave of fear, not panic. Just a deep feeling that something about that situation was very wrong. I slowly raised my flashlight and pointed it across the lake. The beam of light barely reached halfway across the water, and the figure near the trees was gone. Not walking away, not hiding behind anything, just gone. For a moment, I told myself my eyes had been playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something else. The forest around the lake had become completely silent. Even the wind had stopped, and for the first time in my entire career as a ranger, standing alone near that lake, I had the strong feeling that I was not the only one there anymore. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the figure across the lake. When you work in a place like Yellowstone National Park, your mind can play tricks on you. The darkness, the quiet forest, and the long hours alone can make normal things look unusual. That was what I kept telling myself. Maybe it had been an elk that moved away the moment I lifted my flashlight. Maybe the trees and shadows had made the shape look taller than it really was. Still, the feeling in my chest refused to go away. I kept looking across the lake, expecting to see movement somewhere along the trees, but everything stayed perfectly still. After a minute or two, I decided to continue my patrol. The trail around the lake formed a wide circle, and part of my job was to walk along the shoreline to check for illegal camping or people wandering around after hours. I turned my flashlight back toward the trail and started walking along the edge of the water. The ground near the lake was uneven and soft, so I had to move carefully. My light moved slowly over the dirt and stones ahead of me. That was when I noticed something on the ground, footprints. At first, I assumed they belonged to another ranger. Sometimes my co-workers checked the same area earlier in the evening, but when I crouched down and looked closer, the shape of the prints made my stomach feel uneasy. They were human, barefoot. The soil was damp enough to hold the shape clearly. I could see the outline of toes and the curve of the heel. What made it strange was the size. The prints looked longer than a normal human foot. Not extremely large, but long enough to look unnatural. I stared at them for a moment, trying to understand why someone would be walking barefoot in that part of the park, especially at night. The ground around Yellowstone can be cold even during summer evenings. Anyone walking without shoes would feel it immediately. I followed the direction of the prints with my flashlight. They moved along the shoreline for several steps. Then they stopped, right at the edge of the water. I slowly lifted my head and looked out across the lake again. The surface of the water looked just as calm as before, but something about it felt wrong now. It was too still. The kind of stillness that makes the entire place feel like it is waiting. I stepped closer to the shoreline and looked down at the final footprint. The last mark in the soil ended only a few inches from the water. There were no prints leading away, none going back toward the trail. It looked exactly like someone had walked straight into the lake and disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, I considered the possibility that someone might actually be in danger. Maybe a lost hiker had wandered into the water and drowned. My my training, immediately took over. I spoke into my radio and reported my location, telling dispatch that I was checking something unusual near the lake. The signal in that area was weak, but I heard a short response from another ranger confirming that my message had been received. That helped calm me a little. I turned my flashlight toward the water again and slowly scanned the surface. Nothing. Just dark water reflecting the moon. But as I stood there, something else began to bother me. The footprints in the dirt looked fresh. Very fresh. The edges were sharp, like they had been made only minutes earlier, which meant that whoever made them had been near the lake very recently. Maybe even while I was walking down the trail. A cold feeling moved slowly through my body as that thought settled in my mind. I was about to stand up and continue following the shoreline when something in the water caught my attention. At first I thought it was just a ripple moving across the surface, but the lake had been completely calm all night. I pointed my flashlight toward the movement. The beam stretched across the water, shaking slightly in my hand. Near the center of the lake, something dark moved beneath the surface. It moved slowly, almost gently, like a shadow gliding through the water. Too large to be a fish, too smooth to be floating wood. I watched it for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then the shape stopped moving, right in the middle of the lake. For a moment, everything became completely still again. And then I realized something that made the hair on my arms rise. The shadow beneath the water was not swimming. It was rising, very slowly, moving upward toward the surface. I took a step backward from the shoreline without even realizing it. My flashlight stayed pointed toward the lake as the dark shape came closer and closer to the surface. Part of me expected to see an animal break through the water, maybe a moose or some other large creature. But deep down, I already knew that was not what I was about to see. Because whatever had made those long, barefoot footprints on the shore was still out there in the lake, and it was coming closer. I kept my flashlight pointed at the lake, but my hands had started shaking without me realizing it. The dark shape beneath the surface continued rising slowly. The water above it began to move in a smooth circle, spreading outward across the lake. The reflection of the moon broke apart as the surface shifted. Then something appeared above the water. At first I thought it was a piece of driftwood coming up from below, but within a second I realized that idea made no sense, because the object rising from the lake was standing upright. My breath stopped for a moment. A head slowly emerged from the water, then shoulders, then a long upper body. The figure stood there in the lake, half submerged, facing my direction from a distance. The water around it barely moved. It was difficult to see clearly because the moonlight was weak and my flashlight could only reach part of the distance across the lake. But even from far away, I could tell something about the figure looked deeply unnatural. The shape of its body looked too thin. The arms seemed longer than they should have been, and the head looked slightly tilted, like it was observing me in a way that made my stomach feel heavy with fear. For several seconds, neither of us moved. My mind tried desperately to explain what I was seeing. Maybe it was a person who had fallen into the water. Maybe someone had been camping illegally and had tried to hide when they saw my flashlight. But those explanations collapsed quickly as I continued watching. The figure did not struggle against the cold water. It did not swim. It simply stood there, perfectly still. And then something happened that I will never forget. Very slowly, the figure began walking. Not swimming. Walking. Step by step through the water toward the shore where I was standing. The lake in that area was deep enough that a normal person would not be able to walk through it like that. But the figure moved forward smoothly, as if the depth of the lake meant nothing. Each step brought it closer to the surface, closer to the shoreline. I could see more of its body as it moved through the water. Its skin looked pale under the moonlight, not the pale color of a normal person standing in dim light. It looked almost gray, like something that had spent a very long time beneath water or deep underground. My chest felt tight as my brain struggled to process what was happening. I took another step backward. The ground behind me was uneven and covered in small stones. My boot slid slightly as I tried to move quietly. But the figure did not react. It kept walking forward. The water reached its waist, then its knees. Finally, it stepped onto the shallow part of the lake. Now it was close, enough for my flashlight to reach it clearly. And that was when the fear inside me turned into something much deeper, something I still cannot fully explain. The figure looked like a human, but the proportions were wrong. Its arms hung too low, almost reaching its knees. Its body looked thin in a way that did not seem natural for a living person. And its face, even now remembering it, makes my chest feel cold. The face had no clear expression. The skin looked stretched tightly across the bones. The eyes reflected my flashlight in a strange, dull way that reminded me of the way animal eyes sometimes reflect light in the forest at night. But the eyes were too large, and they did not blink. The figure stopped moving when it reached the edge of the water. Only a few meters separated us now. Neither of us spoke. The forest around the lake remained completely silent. Even the wind had not returned. The figure slowly tilted its head again, studying me. Not like a person meeting another person. More like something trying to understand what I was. That was the moment when every instinct inside my body told me the same thing. I needed to leave. Immediately. Without turning my back on it, I slowly began stepping backward toward the trail. My flashlight remained pointed directly at the figure. It did not move. It simply watched me. One step, then another. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. And when I finally reached the beginning of the trail, I turned and started walking quickly toward the ranger truck. I did not run. Running in the dark forest could cause me to trip or fall, but I moved as fast as I safely could. The entire time I felt the strong sensation that the figure was still standing by the lake behind me, watching, following me with its eyes. The walk back to the truck normally took around 10 minutes. That night, it felt much longer. Every shadow between the trees looked wrong. Every movement of branches above me made my nerves tighten. Finally, the trail opened to the small clearing where I had parked the truck. I felt a small wave of relief when I saw the vehicle sitting there under the dim moonlight. But that feeling lasted only a few seconds, because as I walked closer to the truck, I noticed something that made my entire body freeze. The ground around the vehicle was covered in fresh footprints, bare footprints, longer than normal human feet. And they were not just near the lake anymore. They were all around the ranger truck, as if something had been walking there, waiting for me. For several seconds, I just stood there, staring at the ground around the ranger truck. The pale beam from my flashlight moved slowly over the dirt. Footprints were everywhere. Bare footprints, long, thin, and deeply pressed into the soft soil. Some of them circled the truck. Others moved toward the driver's side door. A few prints even led around the back of the vehicle. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Only minutes earlier, I had been standing by the lake watching that tall figure emerge from the water. The distance between the lake and where I had parked the truck was several minutes on foot. which meant that while I had been walking back along the trail, something had already been here, waiting. A cold feeling spread through my chest as that realization settled in my mind. I slowly turned my flashlight toward the forest behind the truck. Tall pine trees surrounded the small clearing, their branches forming dark shapes against the sky. Nothing moved between them, but the silence in that moment felt heavier than anything I had experienced before in the park. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to move. Standing there in the open clearing suddenly felt like the worst possible choice. I walked quickly toward the truck and opened the driver's side door. My hands were shaking badly now, but I managed to climb inside and lock the doors immediately. For a moment, I simply sat there in the seat, breathing slowly, trying to calm down enough to think clearly. My flashlight rested on the passenger seat, still shining faintly across the dashboard. I reached for the radio and contacted dispatch again, explaining that something strange had happened near the lake and that I was heading back toward the main ranger station. I did not try to describe everything I had seen. Even while sitting safely inside the truck, saying it out loud felt impossible. The dispatcher confirmed my message and told me to return to the station. That helped a little. I placed the radio back in its holder and finally started the engine. The headlights lit up the clearing in front of me. The bright light revealed more of the footprints across the ground. They stretched from the tree line all the way to the side of the truck. And when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The footprints did not stop near the vehicle. They continued past it, leading toward the trees on the other side of the clearing, as if whatever made them had been walking around the truck while I was still on the trail, watching, waiting for me to return. I quickly put the truck into gear and began driving down the narrow road leading away from the lake. The tires moved over gravel and dirt as the forest slowly passed beside me. For the first minute, I kept checking the mirrors constantly. Part of me expected to see something running along the road behind the truck, but there was nothing there. Only darkness and trees disappearing into the distance. After several minutes, the tension in my chest began to ease slightly. The road ahead felt more familiar now. I had driven that route hundreds of times during my years working in Yellowstone National Park. I told myself that whatever I had seen by the lake must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe an injured person behaving strangely. Maybe someone living illegally in the forest. My brain tried hard to create explanations that made sense. Then I looked into the rearview mirror again, and the fear returned instantly. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of trees behind the truck. But as the vehicle continued moving down the road, the shape in the mirror became clearer. Something tall was standing in the middle of the road far behind me. The headlights of the truck illuminated it faintly as the distance slowly increased. Even from that far away, I recognized the thin shape immediately. The long arms, the tilted head, the unnatural stillness. The same figure I'd seen walking out of the lake. It was no longer near the water. It had somehow reached the road, and it was standing there watching the truck disappear into the darkness. I pressed harder on the accelerator after that. The engine grew louder as the truck moved faster through the forest. I did not look into the mirror again, not even once. When I finally reached the ranger station, nearly half an hour later, I felt completely drained. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but I could tell from his expression that he did not fully believe what I had described. And honestly, I could not blame him. Even to me, the story sounded impossible. But I know what I saw that night. The footprints, the figure rising from the lake, the thing standing on the road behind me. After that experience, I returned to work for a few more weeks. But every time my patrol route came close to that lake, the same heavy feeling returned. The same sense that something in that part of the forest was aware of me, watching from somewhere beyond the trees. Eventually, I realized something important. Working as a ranger meant spending long nights alone in places where help could be very far away. And after what happened near that lake, I could never shake the feeling that one night I might see that figure again. Only next time, it might not stay standing at a distance. So after 6 years working in Yellowstone, I made a decision I never expected to make. I resigned from my position as a park ranger. I moved to a different state, and I have never returned to that part of the park again. But sometimes late at night, when everything around me becomes very quiet, I still remember the way that figure stood in the lake under the moonlight, watching me from the water, as if the forest had been hiding something all along, something that still lives out there, somewhere inside Yellowstone National Park. My name is Peter, and a few months ago I got hired as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. It was something I had wanted for years. I loved nature, and working in one of the most famous national parks in the world sounded like a dream. When I got the acceptance email, I remember feeling proud of myself. It felt like I was starting a new chapter in my life. And before my first day, I spent time reading about the park. Everyone knows Yellowstone is beautiful, but it is also massive. The forests stretch for miles, and in many areas there is nothing but trees, hills, and wildlife. People disappear in national parks sometimes. I had read stories about hikers getting lost or injured, but I never thought anything strange would happen during my first shift. I arrived at the ranger station early in the morning. The air was cold, and the sky was still pale with the early light. The forest around the station looked peaceful. There was a quiet feeling that I honestly enjoyed. It felt far, away from cities and noise. That morning, I met my supervisor for the first time. His name was Daniel. He had been a ranger for almost 15 years. He looked like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. His skin was rough from the sun, and he had a calm personality. Daniel greeted me with a friendly smile and gave me a quick tour of the station. He showed me the equipment, the radio system, and the maps of the park. The walls were covered with different maps, showing trails, wildlife zones, and restricted areas. One map in particular caught my attention. There was a large area deep in the forest, marked with a red boundary line. I asked Daniel about it. At first, he did not answer right away. He stared at the map for a few seconds, like he was deciding how much he wanted to say. Then he told me it was an old research zone that had been closed to the public years ago. According to him, it used to be used for wildlife observation, but now rangers only entered the area if absolutely necessary. He did not explain why. I remember thinking it was strange, but I assumed it had something to do with protecting animals. Yellowstone has a lot of rules about where people can go. Around the afternoon, Daniel told me we would be doing a patrol together that evening. It was supposed to be simple, just driving through one of the quieter sections of the park to check that no hikers were camping in restricted areas. The day passed normally. I checked equipment, listened to radio instructions, and learned basic procedures. Nothing unusual happened. But when the sun started going down, the atmosphere in the forest began to feel different. Yellowstone at night, and is not like during the day, the trees seemed darker and heavier. The shadows stretched between the trunks, and the forest feels deeper than it actually is. Even the air feels colder. Daniel and I got into the ranger vehicle and drove down a dirt road leading away from the station. The road slowly curved into a thicker part of the forest where the trees grew very close together. At first, we talked casually about the job. Daniel told me stories about rescuing lost hikers and dealing with tourists who ignored safety rules. He sounded relaxed. But after about 20 minutes of driving, the road became narrower, and the forest around us became very dense. Daniel stopped talking. I noticed his eyes kept scanning the trees as we drove. He looked more serious now. I asked him if everything was okay. He said yes. But then he added something that made me uncomfortable. He said, "There are parts of this park that even experienced rangers don't like visiting after dark." I thought he was joking, so I laughed a little. He didn't laugh back. The vehicle eventually stopped near a trail entrance that looked old and rarely used. The sign beside it was faded, and the path disappeared into a thick wall of trees. Daniel turned off the engine and looked at me. He said we needed to check this area because someone reported strange activity here a few days earlier. According to the report, a camper claimed he saw a large figure moving through the trees late at night. At the time, the report was dismissed as someone exaggerating after drinking too much. But Daniel said something about the situation still bothered him. I stepped out of the vehicle and immediately felt how quiet the forest was. There were no voices, no wind, and almost no animal sounds. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and told me to stay close while we walked a short distance down the trail. The path looked like it had not been used in a long time. Small plants were growing across it, and fallen branches were scattered everywhere. After about 10 minutes of walking, Daniel suddenly stopped. He slowly raised his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees on the left side of the trail. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something on the ground. Large footprints. Much larger than any human footprints. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to explain it. But the expression on his face had completely changed. He looked deeply worried. And that was the moment I realized my first shift in Yellowstone was about to become something I would never forget. I stared at the footprints for several seconds, trying to understand what I was looking at. The ground was soft dirt mixed with small patches of wet soil, so the shape of the prints was very clear. Each one looked deep and wide, much bigger than the size of a normal human foot. At first I wondered if it could be a bear. Yellowstone has many bears, and I knew they could grow very large, but something about these tracks did not look right. The shape looked closer to a human foot than an animal paw. Daniel slowly walked closer and crouched down to examine them. He did not speak for a moment. His flashlight moved carefully across the ground, following the trail of prints as they continued deeper into the forest. I asked him if it was a bear. He shook his head slowly. He said the shape was wrong. That answer made the quiet forest feel heavier around us. I suddenly became very aware of how deep we were in the trees and how far the ranger station must have been behind us. Daniel stood up and looked into the dark forest ahead of us. The beam of his flashlight barely reached past the first few rows of trees. Everything beyond that looked like a wall of shadows. Then he said something that made me uneasy. He told me those prints were not here earlier that day. According to him, he had checked this trail 2 days earlier, and the ground had been clear. That meant whatever made those prints had walked through this area recently. Very recently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt uncomfortable. I kept looking around the forest, expecting to see some animal moving through the trees, but everything remained still. Daniel followed the line of prints for several more meters. I walked behind him, trying to stay calm, even though something about the situation felt wrong. The tracks continued along the trail before slowly turning off the path and moving between the trees. That was when Daniel stopped again. He was staring at something ahead. At first, I could not see it clearly. Then I realized what had caught his attention. About 30 meters away, there was an old wooden structure, partially hidden behind the trees. It looked like a small abandoned observation cabin. The roof was damaged, and the wood looked dark from years of weather. It must have been part of the old research zone he mentioned earlier. Daniel looked confused. He told me he did not remember there being a structure this close to the trail. According to the maps, the old research buildings were supposed to be farther inside the restricted area. But there it was. The large footprints in the dirt were leading directly toward it. We slowly walked closer. The closer we got, the more the cabin looked abandoned. The windows were broken, and the wood on the walls had started to split from age. The door was slightly open. Daniel raised his flashlight and aimed it toward the doorway. The inside of the cabin was dark, and the beam of light revealed almost nothing except dust and pieces of broken furniture. He called out, asking if anyone was inside. There was no response. He stepped closer to the door while I stayed a few steps behind him. I remember feeling extremely uncomfortable standing there. Something about the cabin gave me a feeling that I should not be there. Daniel pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. For a moment, everything seemed normal. I could see the beam of his flashlight moving across the walls and floor. Then he suddenly stopped moving. I asked him what was wrong. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his flashlight slowly pointed toward the far corner of the room. From where I stood outside, I could not see what he was looking at, but I could hear his breathing change. It sounded tense, like he had just discovered something he did not expect. I stepped closer to the doorway so I could see inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were more footprints inside the cabin, the same large ones we had followed through the forest. But that was not the worst part. The footprints did not lead toward the door. They came from the back wall of the cabin. I stared at the wooden wall, confused. There was no hole, no broken boards, nothing that looked like an entrance. Daniel slowly walked closer to the wall, shining his flashlight across it. That was when we both noticed something strange. There were long scratches across the wood, deep scratches. They looked like something had forced its way through the wall from the outside. Before either of us could say anything, Daniel suddenly turned toward me. His face had gone pale. He told me quietly that we needed to leave the area immediately. I did not ask questions. Something in his voice told me the situation had just become serious. We started walking quickly back toward the trail, but after only a few steps, Daniel suddenly stopped again. He was staring toward the trees behind the cabin. I followed his gaze. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I saw it too. Between the trees, far in the darkness, there was a tall shape, standing completely still. It was much taller than a person, and it was watching us. That was the moment when everything went terribly wrong. For several seconds, I could not move. My eyes were fixed on the tall shape standing between the trees. The darkness made it difficult to see clearly, but there was no doubt something was there. It stood much higher than Daniel or me. The outline looked thin, but extremely tall, almost unnatural. The figure did not move at all. It simply remained there in the distance, as if it had been waiting for us. Daniel slowly stepped in front of me, raising his flashlight toward the trees. The beam of light stretched across the forest floor and reached the area where the figure had been standing. But the moment the light touched that spot, the shape was gone. The space between the trees was empty. Daniel looked confused for a second. Then he turned to me and said, We needed to return to the vehicle immediately. His voice sounded tense now, very different from earlier that evening. We began walking quickly down the trail. I kept looking behind us because I could not shake the feeling that something was following us through the forest. The path back felt longer than before. The darkness between the trees seemed thicker, and the quiet atmosphere made every step feel heavy. After a few minutes of walking, Daniel suddenly slowed down. He lifted one hand slightly, signaling for me to stop. At first, I did not understand why. Then I noticed what had caught his attention. The large footprints were now on the trail, again, but they were different. Earlier, the prints had been moving away from the trail toward the cabin. Now they were coming toward us. The deep marks in the dirt showed that whatever made them had walked directly along the path we were using to return to the vehicle. Daniel stared at the ground for a moment. I could see his mind trying to understand how that was possible. We had just walked through this same part of the trail a short time earlier. The ground had been clear. Daniel whispered that something was very wrong. Then he raised his flashlight and slowly turned it toward the trees beside the trail. That was when we heard movement somewhere deeper in the forest. Not the sound of a small animal moving through bushes. This sounded heavier, like something large moving slowly between the trees. I felt my heart begin to race. Daniel spoke into his radio, trying to contact the ranger station. His voice was calm but urgent. He reported that we had encountered something unusual and requested another ranger team to check our location. But the radio only produced a rough burst of static. No reply came from the station. Daniel tried again. Still nothing. The forest around us suddenly felt enormous and empty. We were completely alone out there. Then the movement in the trees became closer. Branches shifted somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. Daniel aimed his flashlight in that direction, trying to see what was moving through the forest. For a moment, the beam of light revealed nothing. Then the light caught something standing between two large trees. The same tall figure. This time, it was closer. Much closer. I could see the outline more clearly now. The body looked long and thin, with arms that seemed too long for a normal human body. The head was slightly tilted, and the entire shape looked pale against the darkness of the forest. It did not look like any animal I'd ever seen. Daniel slowly stepped backward, keeping the flashlight pointed at it. He told me quietly to keep moving toward the vehicle without turning around. But before we could take another step, the figure moved. It did not run like a normal person or animal. Instead, it moved forward with a strange, unnatural speed that made my brain struggle to understand what I was seeing. Daniel raised his voice and shouted for it to stay back. The figure continued approaching. Daniel quickly pulled out his emergency flare and ignited it. Bright red light filled the trail, casting long shadows across the trees. For a moment, the creature stopped. The red light revealed its shape more clearly. Its body looked extremely thin, almost stretched. Its skin appeared pale and rough. The head had no clear facial details that I could recognize from that distance. Daniel stood between me and the thing, holding the flare high while telling me to keep moving back. Then everything happened very fast. The creature suddenly rushed forward. Daniel pushed me behind him while raising the flare toward it. I remember hearing him shouting something, but my mind was already overwhelmed with fear. I stumbled backward along the trail, my eyes locked on the scene in front of me. The red light from the flare shook wildly as Daniel struggled with the approaching figure. For a brief moment, I saw the creature reach toward him with long arms. Daniel lost his balance and fell to the ground. The flare rolled across the dirt, casting spinning light through the trees. I stood there frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Then survival instinct finally took over. I turned and ran toward the vehicle as fast as I could. The forest felt endless as I ran down the trail. My lungs burned and my legs felt weak, but fear pushed me forward. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the ranger vehicle waiting near the entrance of the trail. I jumped inside, started the engine, and drove away from that area as fast as I could. I did not stop driving until I reached the ranger station. Other rangers noticed my condition immediately. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out broken and confused. A search team went out later that night to find Daniel. They never found him. The official report later said he likely died during a wildlife encounter in the forest. But I know what I saw that night, and I know it was not any animal listed in Yellowstone records. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I had worked as a park ranger for exactly one shift, and I will never step into that forest again for the rest of my life. My name is Christopher, and I have been a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park for almost 5 years. When people hear my job title, they usually imagine something peaceful. They think I spend my days walking through beautiful forests, watching wildlife, and helping tourists find good hiking trails. Sometimes that part is true. There are many quiet mornings where the air feels clean and the mountains look endless. In moments like that, the job feels like a dream. But there is another side of this work that most people never hear about. One of the things park rangers deal with more often than people realize is missing persons. Yellowstone is massive. It is much bigger than most people imagine when they look at a map. There are deep forests, strange rock formations, valleys that seem untouched by time, and miles of trails where a person could walk for hours without seeing another human being. Most of the time, missing person cases are simple accidents. Someone gets lost, someone twists an ankle, someone walks off the trail and cannot find their way back. We search, we find them, and everyone goes home. But a few cases stay with you. They stay in your head when you try to sleep. The experience I'm about to talk about happened about 2 years ago, but I still think about it almost every week. Even now, I am not sure I fully understand what happened out there. It started with a report late in the afternoon. A family had come to the park for a short hiking trip. According to the report, their teenage son wandered away from the trail while they stopped to rest. At first, they thought he was just exploring nearby, but after almost 2 hours, they realized he was completely gone. His name was Daniel. Search operations like this are taken very seriously. When someone disappears in a place like Yellowstone, time becomes extremely important. The forest becomes dangerous once the sun goes down. Temperatures drop fast, animals move through the area, and the terrain becomes very difficult to navigate. Our team gathered quickly. A few rangers, some volunteers, and 2 search dogs. We packed flashlights, radios, and basic emergency supplies. By the time we started moving into the forest, the sun was already low behind the mountains. At first, everything felt normal. The dogs were following a scent. Daniel's parents had given us a jacket he had been wearing earlier that day. The dogs moved forward with confidence, leading us along a narrow trail that slowly disappeared into thicker forests. I remember the light fading through the trees. The forest in Yellowstone has a strange feeling when evening arrives. The sunlight becomes thin and orange, and the shadows stretch across the ground in long shapes. After about 40 minutes of walking, the trail completely vanished. This happens often in older parts of the park. Trails shift over time, trees fall, and paths slowly disappear. We continued following the dogs deeper into the woods. That was when the first strange thing happened. One of the dogs suddenly stopped moving. At first, I thought maybe the scent had been lost, but the dog was not confused. It was staring ahead, completely still. The handler tried encouraging it forward, but the animal refused to move. The second dog started acting the same way. Both animals were staring into the forest as if something ahead of us made them uncomfortable. I raised my flashlight and looked in the same direction. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just trees, fallen branches, and the dark shapes of rocks scattered across the ground. Then I noticed something. About 30 yards ahead of us, there was a small clearing between the trees, and standing in the middle of that clearing was a pile of clothing. A hoodie, jeans, shoes. They were arranged in a neat stack. Daniel's parents had told us exactly what he was wearing, and the clothes in that clearing matched the description perfectly. But the strange part was not just that the clothes were there. The strange part was how they were placed. It looked like someone had carefully folded them, right there in the middle of the forest. No footprints around them, no sign of struggle. Just a quiet clearing with a pile of clothes where a missing boy should have been. I remember looking at the other rangers, and nobody said anything for several seconds, because we were all thinking the same thing. If Daniel had taken his clothes off out here, where was he now? And why were the search dogs suddenly afraid to move any closer? For a few moments, nobody in our group said anything. We just stood there staring at the pile of clothes in the clearing. The forest around us had become very quiet, and that silence felt heavier than usual. One of the rangers slowly walked forward while shining his flashlight toward the ground. He was careful not to disturb anything in case there were footprints or signs that could help us understand what happened. When he reached the clothes, he crouched down and examined them closely. "They belong to the missing kid," he said quietly. The jacket matched the description exactly. The jeans and shoes were the same ones his parents described earlier at the ranger station. There was no doubt about it. But there was still no sign of Daniel. The ground around the clearing looked strange. Normally in a forest, you would expect to see footprints, broken plants, or disturbed dirt if someone had been walking around. But the soil looked smooth and untouched. One of the volunteers circled the clearing with his flashlight, searching carefully. "Nothing," he said. "No tracks going away from here." I remember feeling a slow wave of confusion and discomfort spreading through my chest. A person does not simply disappear from a place like that without leaving some kind of trace. The handler tried guiding the search dogs closer to the clothes, but the animals continued resisting. They lowered their bodies toward the ground and refused to move forward. Their behavior was something I had never seen before during a search operation. Eventually, the handler decided not to force them. We collected the clothes and carefully packed them into a bag so investigators could examine them later. Then we continued searching the surrounding forest. By this time, the sun had completely disappeared. Darkness settled over the trees, and the only light came from our flashlights. The forest looked completely different at night. Familiar shapes during the day turned into strange shadows after sunset. We moved slowly, calling Daniel's name every few minutes. "Daniel, this is Park Service. If you can hear us, answer back." Our voices echoed between the trees, then faded into the distance. No response. About 20 minutes later, we reached a part of the forest that looked unfamiliar, even to me. I had worked in Yellowstone for years, but there were still areas that felt untouched and rarely visited. The trees were taller there, and the ground was covered with thick moss. Walking became more difficult because the terrain dipped into shallow slopes and uneven ground. That was when something else strange happened. My radio suddenly filled with static. At first, I thought it was just a normal signal problem. Radios sometimes lose connection in remote parts of the park. But the strange part was that every radio in our group started doing the same thing at the same time. The communication channel turned into constant static noise. One of the other rangers tried switching frequencies, but nothing changed. The static continued. That meant we had lost contact with the main team back at the ranger station. Normally, that situation would not be a major problem. We could still return using our maps and GPS devices. But when I checked my GPS unit, I noticed something that made my stomach feel tight. The screen was showing our location incorrectly. According to the device, we were somewhere miles away from where we should have been. It placed us in a section of the park that did not match the terrain around us. I showed the screen to the other ranger beside me. He looked confused. "That cannot be right," he said. While we were trying to understand the problem, one of the volunteers whispered something. "Do you hear that?" Everyone stopped moving. At first I heard nothing except the quiet sound of wind moving through the trees. Then I noticed it. Far in the distance, somewhere deeper in the forest, there was a voice. It sounded like someone calling for help. The voice was weak, almost like it was carried by the wind, but the words were clear enough. "Help me!" We immediately looked at each other. That had to be Daniel. The voice came again, a little louder this time. "Help me! Over here!" Without wasting time, we began moving toward the direction of the voice. The possibility that Daniel was still alive pushed away our confusion about the radio signals and the strange GPS reading. We walked quickly through the forest, stepping over fallen branches and pushing past thick plants. The voice continued guiding us deeper into the woods. "Over here." The strange thing was that the voice always seemed the same distance away, no matter how far we walked. 10 minutes passed, then 15. We should have reached him already. But the voice continued coming from somewhere ahead. One of the volunteers finally spoke. "Does that voice sound strange to anyone else?" Nobody answered immediately, because we were all beginning to realize the same disturbing detail. The voice sounded like a teenage boy, but the tone never changed, not once. It sounded exactly the same every time. The same words, the same tone, the same distance. As if something in the forest was repeating the same call again and again. And that was the moment when I began to feel something I had never felt before during a search operation. For the first time in 5 years as a park ranger in Yellowstone, I started wondering if we were not the ones searching anymore. It felt like something else was guiding us deeper into the forest. At that moment, nobody in our group felt confident anymore, but we kept moving forward. The voice still drifted through the forest ahead of us, repeating the same request for help in the same calm tone. It sounded human, but something about it felt wrong in a way that is difficult to describe. One of the rangers beside me finally spoke in a low voice. That voice has not changed once. He was right. A real person asking for help would sound tired, afraid, or desperate. Their voice would break or shake after a long time in the cold forest. But the voice we were following sounded exactly the same every single time. The same words, the same distance, the same calm tone. Still, none of us wanted to ignore the possibility that the missing boy was somewhere ahead. If there was even a small chance he needed help, we had to keep going. We continued walking through the forest for several more minutes until the trees began thinning out again. Eventually, we reached another clearing. The voice stopped. Complete silence filled the forest. Every flashlight in our group moved slowly across the clearing, searching for any sign of Daniel. At first, I thought we had reached the wrong place. There was no one standing there, no movement. just a wide, open area surrounded by tall trees. Then one of the volunteers quietly said something. "Look up." I raised my flashlight toward the trees, and that was when I felt the most disturbing feeling I have ever experienced in my life. High above us, hanging from the branches of several trees, were pieces of clothing. Not just one or two, there were many. Shirts, jackets, shoes, pieces of fabric moving slowly in the cold night air. Some of them looked old and faded, like they had been there for a very long time. Others looked newer, including one item that immediately caught my attention: a gray hoodie, the exact same type that had been found folded in the clearing earlier. For a few seconds, nobody moved or spoke. We just stood there looking up at the branches above us. It looked like dozens of missing people had left pieces of themselves hanging in those trees. That was when the voice returned. But this time, it did not come from ahead of us. It came from behind us. "Help me!" Every person in our group slowly turned around. The voice sounded closer than before. Much closer. I lifted my flashlight and pointed it toward the dark forest behind us. The beam of light moved across tree trunks and thick plants. Then it stopped. About 20 feet away from us, standing between two trees, there was a figure. At first, I thought it might be Daniel. The height looked similar to a teenager. But something about the shape of the body felt strange. The figure was standing completely still. No movement at all. The person was not wearing any clothes. And the face looked completely blank. No clear features. Just pale skin reflecting the light from my flashlight. None of us spoke. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, we just stared at that figure. Then one of the volunteers suddenly said something that still echoes in my mind. "That is not a kid." The moment those words were spoken, the figure slowly stepped backward into the darkness between the trees. Within seconds, it was gone. The forest became silent again. No voice, no movement, nothing. We stood there for a long time, trying to understand what we had just seen. Eventually, the team leader made the decision to end the search for the night. Our equipment was malfunctioning. Communication was gone, and the situation had become too strange to ignore. We slowly walked back toward the direction we believed led to the main trail. Strangely, once we left that area, our radios started working again. The GPS devices returned to normal. It was as if whatever interference had happened in that part of the forest simply disappeared. Daniel was never found. Search teams continued looking for several days, but there was no trace of him anywhere in the park. Official reports listed the case as a missing person, but every ranger who was there that night remembers the same things. The folded clothes, the voice repeating the same words, the trees filled with abandoned clothing, and the silent figure standing in the darkness. I have worked in Yellowstone for almost 5 years now, and I have seen many difficult situations. Most of them can be explained by accidents, weather, or human mistakes. But that night is different. Even today, when I walk through certain parts of the forest during patrol, I sometimes remember that clearing. And every time I remember it, I find myself asking the same question again and again. Should I really continue working as a park ranger here? Or are there places in this park where humans were never meant to go?